Hello and welcome back to the Jumpstart, Accelerated Jumpstart program for deploying Office 365, preparing you for the certification exam. This is Module 8, combination with Module 9. We will talk about Exchange Online hybrid scenarios. Ajinka will walk you through implementing those scenarios. And when we talk about those scenarios, when you look at the agenda for today, that will be very, very lengthy, very, very intense, two modules. Hybrid scenarios are probably the most common ones you will encounter because most of those environments that we encounter are not some customers starting from scratch, greenfield. They have an environment. If they start from Exchange, they most of the time don't have a cutover where they move over the weekend. Larger customers in particular, it takes them time, it takes them planning. You go department by department. So those are very, very complicated. And everything you learned yesterday is actually preparing you for those hybrid scenarios. ADFS, single sign-on, DirSync, all of those are base requirements to make those actually work. So keep that in the back of your head while Ajinka is walking through it. So talk us through the agenda for today.
Thank you. Sure. About. Just before I jump into the agenda here, just like to kind of throw out a disclaimer, star. We went through the previous deck, and there were a couple of probably comments on the last piece. So we walked through the entire code. There was no skip there. And I walked you through the appendix towards the last portion. Now, the appendix is designed to help you study when you're preparing for the exam. It's kind of elaborates on what we've discussed a little bit more and gives you kind of reference materials to go through. So that's what the appendix is built for. So that's pretty much all that I want to show.
So, and just to clarify, when we see things like Exchange hosted encryption, is that the topic on the exam, or is this more to understand this because it's a part of...
So I wish I could say this topic's on the exam. This one's not, but
it might be, right?
Well, it's Office 365 exam, and hosted encryption is surely a part of it. From a planning and deployment perspective, maybe not as major chunk that we can really spend time and talk about it. But like we said, two pieces or a couple of pieces that are going to help you really prepare for the exam and deliver it. Like day one was just a brush up for the 323 administering exam, where just to kind of revise through a bit, and then we started day two and day three, which is focused towards the 321 exam, which allows you to get prepared for the planning and deployment pieces, right? But what we want you to understand and help make you successful is this is not the only piece that you should be looking at, right? These exams are built to dig into your experience, your skills and your understanding of Office 365 and get that out on the table, right? And the tough exams when it comes to that. So with this is going to help you go through, understand the pieces, but hands-on, building your labs, going through this entire piece structure is surely going to help make you successful. So don't miss out on those pieces.
Yep. Okay. So look at it, familiarize yourself with it, and be prepared to have maybe a question or two.
Exactly. All right. So without further ado, let's jump into the Exchange migration pieces. So there's going to be a solid focus on hybrid deployments throughout these two sessions. So I'm going to start around more on the planning pieces. We have XYZ migration techniques. How do you align those into different customer scenarios, and how do you decide which would be the best possible one that you should deploy or suggest to your customer? Now that's the solid planning pieces. In session 2, we'll get into more about how do you deploy these pieces. Now, when we get into deployment, that's also going to help you with the 323 exam, which is administering. which talks about managing these environments. So deploying, administrating kind of go hand in hand when it comes to the hybrid portion. So do pay focused, and as always, the Q&A, you guys are doing great on the questions, and we're catching up with answering them because we have a huge list of them. So let's get right into it. So when we talk about Office 365 and the Exchange Online migration piece, the first assumption that we're making there is the customer has an existing email system, like Stefan said, and that's the piece that probably introduces the complication, right? So if it's a greenfield scenario, customers just getting into the first time into a mail system, or they just don't have any data that they need, then it's simple. You simply just subscribe them into the online service and they're good to go. But considering the factors that they already have an email system, and that brings its own complications and constraints, and it's important to understand, one, what their existing system is, what is it integrated with, what is it talking with, and what is the bulk or size of information and users that we're talking about that we need to migrate. Second is, what type of email system are they running, right? So are they running a POP emailing system currently, or POP or IMAP, or are they running an Exchange SMTP system? Is it on-premise? Is it hosted with a third-party provider? These are the kind of inputs that you're looking for in order to align a migration solution to them. So from a Microsoft standpoint, we have basically divided it into 4 migration techniques that you can use. First one is the IMAP migration. So that's based on the free tool that's there through the console. So IMAP is email only that you can migrate. So you connect to the existing mail server that should support an IMAP connection. You extract all the emails there in and pull it into the Exchange Online system. Fairly simple, straightforward. There's some limitations or caveats to it, which we'll talk about in just a bit. Second is cutover migration. So this is more about you have an email system and you probably just want to migrate out over the weekend into Exchange Online, right? So that's the kind of piece that we're talking about. No coexistence, nothing, just one shot and you're on the online services. One of the most simplest migration techniques that you can deploy. Third is staged migration. So that's more about doing batches of migration, slowly but steadily getting onto the Exchange Online system. Very, very basic level of coexistence, or should I say no real coexistence as such, except for the address list or the global address list. That's as much that there is in coexistence. And the last one, the hybrid, which is the major chunk that really allows you to have the on-premise or a third-party email system and the Exchange Online system living together for a longer period of time to ensure that end users are getting a great experience throughout the migration. So on the right of your screen, you'll see a little supportability map as to which migration technique should be used for which system you're coming from. So this is a great way to look and decide, okay, so a customer has Notes or Domino, for example. Out of the box, the free tools that we provide, it's clear you can only use IMAP migration there. Now, there are third-party tools available from partners like yourself that you can use here, but from Microsoft, that's the migration techniques that are relevant to the context that we're talking about today in terms of the exam. All right, so IMAP basically supports any type of mail system because you're just connecting, drawing that email, putting it in there. cutover is built, or the REST cutover stage in hybrid is built for Exchange migrations, right? So any email system, Exchange migration, separate. For cutover supports, any version right from 2003 to 2010, we're not supporting migrations from systems before that. For Stage, we're supporting 2003 and 2007. Now, this is a common question, or I'd say a lack of planning when it comes to customers that are on Exchange Server 2010. So how does this all bubble up, right? When we talk about staged migration, the first piece that you're deploying is directory synchronization. And customers love that because they don't have to really create users or manage them in the cloud. They just synchronize it and they're good. They need to manage it out of one place. But on the other hand, if you have an Exchange 2010 system, you're not going to be able to do directory synchronization before migrating mailboxes. Okay? So stage migration is not going to work for an end customer. And for the guys who are wondering, okay, I'm putting in stage migration, but I'm putting in directory synchronization, but how does that switch to stage migration? Well, that's how the Office 365 system is built. The minute you deploy directory synchronization, it's kind of, you're throwing a switch in terms of the migration tech tool that's going to be available to you. So the minute you enable directory synchronization on the Office 365 console, the only migration that it's going to allow you to do to the migration tool in Office 365 is going to be staged. Okay? So that's how it works. So for Exchange 2010, suggested technique, if it's a small organization, would be somewhere on the cut-over migration. But if it's a fairly large organization and you have the opportunity to have a much better user experience, so deploying hybrid. Again, deploying hybrid is not a one-day program as simple as deploying Exchange Online. It's a little bit more, requires much more planning and infrastructure to have hybrid in place. So you need to take a call in terms of cost, administrative labor, a lot of pieces before you can actually take a call in terms of user experience. All right, so let's try to put out a couple of guidelines in terms of what are the pointers that you should be looking for while choosing different types of migration techniques. Now, you could have numerous number of scenarios that customers would pose to you, right? What these are going to help you is to identify from those customer scenarios and make more sense out of them and align them into the different migration techniques available and which would be the best one that the customer can go for, or which would be the options that the customer would have. So if you're looking for different, first input would be the number of users that the customer has. So it could range from 1 to I don't know how much. So for discussion sake, we'll use 25,000 for, say, the normal Office 365 subscription. So the second input that you're looking for is how much time do you have for migration? All right, so you're looking at less than a week to get migrated to the cloud. Is it a month that you have, or is it like 6 months, a year that you can run the migration? And 6 months and a year could sound ridiculous, but that's real life. A lot of customers require that amount of time to slowly and steadily move into the online services. Not because they don't have the infrastructure to do it, or because it's not possible, but simply for the reason that they have a large number of users, and it just becomes that much more easier to manage over a longer period of time as compared to trying to rush into it and try to get it done in a week or a month.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about a large number of users in that case, something that I'm not sure if it's going to be on the exam, but from a live perspective, you have to consider if those users are used to an Exchange 2003 environment or even a non-Exchange environment. That's training involved. That's a huge concern, and that's why actually customers push for longer cycles, which in some sense makes it easier for you because it gives you a planning horizon. On the opposite, it makes it harder for you if you don't have that planning horizon. The less time you have, the more quickly you have to go into either cutting over staging or go into a hybrid scenario. So training is one of the aspects that a lot of times is a factor on the user side.
That's very true, very true. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So so the first input, number of users, like Stefan very rightly pointed out, as you have more number of users or a different environment from where the customer is coming from, either a legacy Exchange or a third system altogether, the user experience is going to change. There's going to be a learning curve that they need to go through. And giving them time, resources to do that is going to help smoothen out the migration process in real life. So the third input that you're looking at with the number of users, the amount of time that you have to migrate, and the third input is around what are the feature sets that you're looking at during the migration period. So if you're looking at about a week or so, does it make sense to really set up a hybrid system is going to be a question. Now, from a best practice standpoint or recommendation standpoint, we would not recommend to deploy hybrid for a 1 week migration period, because you're going to probably take about a week to deploy hybrid, right, to actually start the migration. But in real life, you could have a scenario or customer who requires to have a hybrid setup because they need to have FreeBSD information being shared. They cannot afford to lose out on even a day of FreeBSD information not being shared across the organization. It could be chaotic for them. So that's a real life scenario that you're going to have to look at and help the customer through, build timelines of migration accordingly with them, plan with them. But from a recommendation standpoint, if you're looking at getting to the cloud in a week, right? So there are two drive points here. One is I'm saying that, okay, I want to get to the cloud or be on the cloud in about a week's time. And the second driver is that I need to have a much richer coexistence when I'm migrating to the cloud. So I could be a little flexible on the time it takes to actually get there. Right? So these are the two pieces or the three pieces that you're looking at when it comes to the migration scenarios as inputs, indicators as to what kind of technique you should ideally be looking at. And again, another piece of cool animation coming in the screen right now. So which migration technique would you actually suggest or tend towards in a best practice scenario while with these different inputs? So if you're looking at about 150 users less, in real life I've done that for more users in terms of cutover. Probably the max I've done for cutover is about 200, 250. You have such scenarios. So but the ideal recommendation, you want to stay around 100, 150 max for about cutover, because that's going to really, really kill your bandwidth, and it's going to take more amount of time to synchronize that data from on-premise to the online services in one solid go. So that's cutover migration. So it's around 150 users, probably a week's time for migration. You're probably starting this batch Friday evening before you leave. You're letting it run over the weekend when your bandwidth's probably the least used, and you come by Monday. Maybe it's done, maybe it's not. You let it run because that's okay, and you continue to use the existing mail system while that data synchronizes. And we'll talk about what these pieces are, where you got to pull the trigger and say, okay, now this is the point where I'm going to switch the MX record from the on-premise situation to the online piece. The second is would you tend towards more of a staged Exchange migration. So I've used abbreviations like CEM standing for Cut Over Exchange Migration, SEM for Staged Exchange Migration on your screens right now. So don't get confused. These are not new terms that you need to learn, but they're just the migration techniques that are available. So the minute you're crossing about 150 users, you want to look at stage migration, thinking about how you're going to, more being able to have more control over the entire migration process and do it in a more staged or slower manner where you're taking chunks of users and migrating them in batches. Now, these numbers are indicative again. This is like best practice recommendations that we have on the screen. You can have more inputs that tend you even for 100 user organization to have a staged migration. That could be possible. And one real life scenario that I can bring is you have a single administrator that needs to do all of these things. And they need to manage the end user training, they need to manage the issues and concerns, configuration, and do the migration. And it could be a little overwhelming if one person needs to deal with 100 people at one go. So that could be one of the reasons why you may want to go for stage Exchange migration as opposed to cutover when you're looking at even a 100-piece or even a 50-user chunk for that matter. And I've loads of customers that tend this way, but the piece that you want to plan for is as you're doing this migration is what is the user experience impact going to be as you're migrating batches. And in a stage Exchange migration, you ideally don't want to stretch it more than a month. I mean, a month would be pushing it literally, but ideally about 2 weeks, 3 at the max, and you should be done with this stage Exchange migration. Because the only things that you're going to get in stage Exchange migration in terms of coexistence while you're doing these batch migrations is the global address list, and second is emails are going to route between the on-premises and the online system. So that's the only two things. You're not going to be able to share FreeBSD information. You're not going to be able to assign rights across these, and you're going to have to plan for groups of people to be migrated who need mandatorily to share FreeBSD information and have mailbox rights across each other. So that's a little piece as a caveat there with stage Exchange migration that you want to keep in mind when planning that piece. The third is hybrid. So the minute you're looking at hybrid, you're saying that ideally your migration time period is going to be a long-term engagement, right? And it could also mean that a customer is going to stay in that mode of hybrid for a very, very undefined time period. Maybe they just don't want to migrate all their users to the cloud. They want to keep some on their existing email system and some in the cloud. Recommended when you're doing hybrid, you can do it only with an Exchange server. So you put in Exchange 2010 and you build that hybrid environment for them. So if a customer needs to stay out in the long term, they can continue to use a legacy Exchange system at the back end behind the Exchange 2010 box. But the ideal situation would be when they're on the Exchange 2010 box in terms of mailboxes and they're running with the cloud in hybrid. That'll give them a perfect experience. So that's hybrid. You have several months and the planning pieces. Again, any questions around these? Are you guys able to relate these to probably some of the experiences that you've had in the past? Please feel free to share them in the Q&A, and we'll be happy to look at them as feedback and as learning for us as well, and also share them with other folks in the forum. All right, so with that, let's look at more decision factors, more pointers to help you decide which migration technique is going to help. So we've talked about a couple of pieces, and I've tried to summarize this on this particular deck here, right here. So the first piece is, from where are you migrating, right? So are you migrating from Exchange? Are you migrating from IMAP or Lotus Notes or Google? Which is your piece of migration? So that's going to be first solid input to tell you which migration technique is going to work. Remember the little chart on that I was talking about as to which migration tool supports which source server or which source email system. That's going to be your first decision point. Second is, what's the organization size, and also what is the size of data that you're looking for. So a lot of times we look at the number of users, but we forget that even if you have less users, you can have a large amount of data that you need to migrate. And that could be a huge constraint. So you want to look at both these pieces, and that's your input to decide. Third is, what is the user experience that the customer requires during the migration or the coexistence portions. And the next one is going to be around how do you want to manage users' mailboxes? Do you want them to be automatically provisioned? Do you want to do it manually? What's the kind of technique that you're looking for? And last is around what Fulvio was talking yesterday in terms of ADFS and DirSync, is how do you want the end users to authenticate finally when your migration is either over or your hybrid scenario is set up? Do you want them to have two different user IDs and passwords, one on premises, one on cloud, or you want them to have the same user ID, so you're running DirSync between on-premises and the cloud, but two different passwords? Or do you want them to just use one user ID and password, which is their on-premises identity? So that's another point that's going to help you with phasing out your migration. So you could have kind of doing a staged migration to start with, but you can have a staged migration with SSO as a combination. So you're not doing Exchange Federation, but you're combining stage migration and you're giving the single sign-on experience to the end users. So that could be a combination permutation that you're looking for. The same could be with Kadova migration. The only difference is going to be when you can place the single sign-on component in your whole migration technique. So you need to complete your Kadova migration first. Only then you're going to be able to introduce DirSync and ADFS. Right? So you have your deployment planning right there. Right? A bit of comparison between these different migration techniques, and probably Stefan and myself can help bring some more scenarios to these different migration techniques. So look, Stefan actually put a nail in the head, and so initially when we said, hey, a simple question, can I do this migration over the weekend? If you can, maybe you're looking at Kadova, right? It's going to be there. So that's a kind of an easy way to start, simple way to start. And, if you want to braze it out in your mind and say, okay, so my customer is XYZ, or I'll say my customer is Stefan. Stefan has about say 15 users in his organization. He doesn't need too many because they're highly efficient. Okay, so they use email, but the data size in there is fair, maybe about 1 gig per user. It's not that high, and since they're making a lot of money, they have a good bandwidth, right? in place. So that gives me an opportunity as a partner or a person looking at Stefan as a customer to make a decision. Okay, so I have about 15 users. I have a good bandwidth in place to move data to the cloud, and maybe I can just do this over the weekend. Just bang, just start the cutover migration, and I'm there. So that could be a great pointer. But on the other hand, say for example, Stefan is already running a multi-million-dollar company. Now, this is all hypothetical. He's not told me about his secret company yet. So he's running a multi-million-dollar company, and he has a large organization, maybe about 500 users in his organization. They all use email. But the way the organization works, their business, they don't need to really have a lot of FreeBSD information traversing, except for certain pockets. Like Stefan and his assistant needs to share FreeBSD information. His assistant needs to have his mailbox right so that they can check emails, because Stefan probably travels a lot as the head of the organization. So that's the kind of scenario I'm looking at. Maybe I'm tending towards, okay, so I probably need to plan this a little bit more. I can't do this over the weekend for sure. I need to identify which are the groups of people that need to migrate to the cloud together. And I probably want to have a word with Stefan as to what are the different pieces that he may require with FreeBSD information, global address list. Does he want to migrate everybody to the cloud at the end of the day, or would he like to keep some of the users on premise? What is he looking at doing?
Yeah, at the same time, just to add to that scenario, what you also have to consider is when you talk about FreeBSD information, right? My assistant is somebody who has to share the information with me all the time. They need to see my calendar. There's delegation, right? Mailbox delegation that goes on, especially with executive assistants, with between people in the organization. And also when we talk about bandwidth, I might have a lot of bandwidth. And the second scenario didn't mention how much bandwidth my multi-million-dollar company has, but let's assume we have a decent amount of bandwidth. Do I want to use up all that bandwidth, or do I need to reserve some of that bandwidth?
Exactly.
Right? So you have to be really, really careful on saying, well, there's a lot of bandwidth available right now. I just assume I have everything available at all times for the synchronization, even over the weekends. Maybe there are batch jobs running that require the internet connectivity. So be very careful and take all of this into consideration. And we use that guidance that we provided. That is very helpful, but there's a lot of nuances that just have to be considered, and tread carefully on that and take this all in consideration when planning it out.
Exactly. So, like I've been saying, what we're sharing is, at least on the DEX, is best practice is what you want to follow in terms of how to decide which migration technique you're going to go for with these different inputs. But in real life, there could be scenarios where you have to diverge from these particular best practices for a reason which is very real to that customer. So, for example, the scenario that I was talking about, where Stefan has 15 users in his organization, a good bandwidth that I can dedicate for migration, but at the same time, he wants to he has a lot of people moving around in the organization. They're mostly traveling, and he wants me to do the migration only when users are in the office, so that we're in a position to set up their desktops and help them understand what are the little differences in what they've been using and what they probably need to look at now. And that's going to mean that I'm probably going to have to stretch that migration for a longer period of time as compared to just a weekend. Right? So that's a real-life situation that you could have. But what we want you to focus on is these best practices of the decision framework, and then when you're in the field, just plug in those additional concerns that could be technically related or more about logistically related to that particular customer and then make a suggestion to them based on which which migration technique you would be able to use. Right. Another piece when you're planning for hybrid migrations or cutover migrations or stage migrations is the TCO, right? So the total cost of ownership. So when we're talking about cloud services, we're ideally moving the total cost of ownership into Microsoft because we're implementing the systems in our data centers and providing it as a service based on a subscription. But when you're looking at more complex deployment scenarios like the hybrid scenario, where you need to deploy certain equipment, hardware, software on-premise to help integrate the customer's on-premises equipment or line of business applications with the online system, then you need to also consider the shift of total cost of ownership a bit for the cloud services that's moving back to the customer on-premise, because they're going to have to manage the on-premises piece, and it's going to be an administrative task. They're going to need to ensure that the on-premises equipment is also up and running for full functionality to be in place. So that's what we're talking about and the little considerations that you want to have. Right. So if you wanted to just kind of differentiate in terms of what are the feature sets that will be available for you if you're doing a stage migration versus hybrid. Now, this is a great chart to do planning because it says, okay, when I did the inputs gathering with the customer, they said, okay, I'm going to need to have a longer migration time to smoothen out the migration because I have users that probably need some more training, etc. So that means I may require FreeBSD information during that time. I may need some other additional pieces in terms of the whole scenario. So this kind of chart helps you identify between staged and hybrid, and it tells you exactly what feature set you would get with stage, what feature set you will get with hybrid. So I'll leave this for your reference, and this is a great tool when you're in the field having that conversation, so I'd suggest keep it handy. All right. All right, and some basic examples. This is, if I would just go one ahead, we're going to start from here for the next session, migration tools. But just to run through a couple more scenarios to, put into context what we just discussed into a number of decision point or inputs that you want to consider and map it back to the actual deployment technique that you're going to go for a particular customer. So again, these scenarios are based on the best practice pieces that we just shared. So they could be a little bit, in real life, you could or may have to diverge from this, like the little pieces of logistics that we talked about earlier. So let's look at the scenario one, and probably Stefan, you want to add some more in this because I know this is a lot that hits you in the field as well. So when you're looking at the first piece, we have the source as the input. We have Exchange 2007 basically, and we have about 250 users that we need to migrate. This organization is really looking at getting into the cloud, what it seems like to me, in kind of an urgent way, right? So probably the Exchange 2007 hardware is running out of warranty. Simple indicator, and they're saying, it could die. That hardware could die out any moment. I need to get into Exchange Online, so I'm ensuring that I don't run into a downtime situation. So that's a real life situation, yep. And you have a lot of customers and partners that come to us saying, hey, can you help us get there, right? So your weekend time period is the weekend, but there's a bit of piece that you want to look at here. They're looking at identity management on-premise, which means that they want to manage their users in their local Active Directory and not on the cloud, right? So that's the piece. So here you can have two pieces that you want to look at. You have a high number of users. You have about 250 users, which is quite a big bulk. And you're saying you want to migrate them over the weekend. So you want to probably break this down into chunks of users and first deploy directory synchronization because they want to manage users on-premise, right? So directory synchronization will sync all the users into Active Directory online, and after that, you'll start a staged migration using the migration tool in the Office 365 portal. This is going to smooth out the user synchronization creation and the migration process for you. Now, like I said, this is best practice. You could have a divergence from this based on some additional criteria or constraints that that customer could have. Second scenario is on Exchange 2003. The customer has Exchange 2003, about 75 users, and you're looking at a weekend migration again. But this customer also is looking at identity on-premise, so identity management on-premise, which indicates to us that they're looking at deploying DirSync to achieve that and manage users through on-premise Active Directory only. So again, you're tending towards staged migration here for a smooth flow of your user synchronization and then migrating users into the cloud.
Maybe the added complexity, what's different, right? Exchange 2007, Exchange 2003, right? We have less users, but it seems very, very much the same. But what goes along with Exchange 2003 a lot of times is Office 2003, which is not supported as a client, specifically Outlook 2003, as a client for Office 365, unless you want to do POP3 or IMAP, right?
Yeah.
So you have to upgrade all your users. Now, we have 75 users, relatively manageable, but still 75 users, 75 desktops you have to hit and update on their client side too. So that adds to the time frame of how you can roll this out.
That's right. That's a very real scenario. But from a best practice standpoint, what you're looking at, the key indicator to actually going for stage migration here is identity management on-premise.
On-premises, exactly.
Right? That's your decision point.
Yep.
Because if you're deploying DirSync after doing a cutover migration, that's going to be that's going to have its own challenges when you actually deploy it. So the staged deployment for this particular scenario would be the best recommendation. So the third one is around Exchange 2010. Again, the source is Exchange 2010. You have about 75 users again. Time is the weekend. But your identity management that we're talking about is only in the cloud. Right? So you're going to manage users in the cloud. And the point that we discussed here is Exchange 2010 does not support staged migration. So the suggestion to the customer is to manage users in the cloud, but in real life scenario, you're going to have customers that are going to say, okay, we understand that we don't support stage migration for Exchange 2010, but once it's done, we would like to manage users on-premise or through Active Directory. So once this migration is done using cutover, that's when you would introduce DirSync and you would take the customer to a identity management on-premise.
Yeah, and that would imply a hybrid deployment at that point.
Not really. So there could be two scenarios there again. You could have a coexistence after this migration where you probably want to keep some users on-premise and deploy that Exchange 2010 hybrid model, or you want to decommission the on-premise Exchange 2010. So you'd basically decommission it and launch DirSync into that system.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the fourth scenario is again, Exchange 2010 on-premise, about 250 users. And this talks clearly what Stefan was pointing out as to having on-premise identity management, right? So that's your hybrid deployment purely. But there's much more to it in terms of hybrid deployment. There's a lot of things that you need to do on-premise as well. So, which we'll get into more and more detail as we go around. And these are from best practice standpoint, but again, getting real, hybrid may not be the only option. It could be doing a cutover and then deploying DirSync in that particular situation. Could be the one. For the fifth example, again, this is Exchange 2003, about have 75 users. Again, your key pointer here is where you're going to manage the identities, and this is in the cloud. So if it's in a weekend, we're just going for a cutover migration, simple piece, we're done, we decommission the on-premises Exchange, and we're good with the cloud completely. And the last one talks about Exchange 2003 with 2,000 odd users, and you have about 1 week for migration. Suggested where you would be to put in DirSync, manage your identities on-premise, and do a staged migration. Now remember, we have a little bit of flexibility when we talk about DirSync here, because last year we enabled DirSync to be enabled and disabled. Before that, we couldn't actually disable DirSync. So once you commit to it, you were just committed, fixed. But now you can disable DirSync. So you can play around a little bit with these migration techniques and enable and disable DirSync as well. So that's not a problem, but when you look at doing that, there's a bit of cleanup that you may just have to do with the online systems. So be worried about that. So that's these 6 scenarios that we have, and we'll talk about a bit of introduction into migration tools as we have a bit of time here on our hands, and with the next session we'll start drilling down into the actual migration techniques in terms of cutover, staged, and hybrid. We'll talk about what those techniques, what you need to do to deploy them, what are the caveats, and that'll give you a bigger picture when you're making the decisions in addition to the decision framework that we just discussed, or the planning framework that we just discussed. So the first tool that's available to you for migration is through the online online Microsoft Online portal, and you click on the Manage button for Exchange Online, which basically takes you to the Exchange Management Console, and you're able to use the email migration tool there to migrate users either using IMAP, cutover, or staged. Right. The second way that you can do it is using PowerShell, using a bit of PowerShell commands. So I've listed them out for you here. I've been sharing the PowerShell link. It's part of the resources in this deck as well, where you can reference out all the PowerShell commandlets that are supported with the online services. All right, so I'll kind of pause there. We can take about a 10-minute break, and
yep. Let's end the first part of Exchange Online Hybrid here, Module 8. Continue with Module 9 after a break of about 10 minutes. Then we go, as Ajinkya said, really deep into how those migration works, what steps are involved, what intricacies and complexities are there. Please keep the questions coming. I hope we set you up and give you a good understanding what the difference between cutover, staged, and hybrid environment is in those migrations. And with that, we'll take a break and be back in 10 minutes.
Catch you soon.
And one last thing, there's a poll open. Please go out and complete the poll real quick while you have time. Thank you.
Feedback is good. Thank you.